good morning, everyone. Good morning. And if you had a chance to listen to Stephanie last night with the rainfall simulator, helps you understand the water cycle, right? And so the trick to that rainfall simulator, you have to do your work ahead of time. So you have to do a good job on the pans when you cut the pans and get them full and fill them with the soil. Make sure there's no water can leak along the sides. See that they're all secured and in place. You did a really nice job on that. And so once that's done, then last night's the easier part, actually. So, but you got to put some work into it ahead of time. And then you have to have a bad guy. There's no bad soils, but like people, some soils have had a tougher life. And that doesn't mean the soil that performed the poorest last night for infiltration, we could make that soil the best one. We can change the management on it. We have to have a green plant bringing carbon into it. We can change the management on it and make it the highest functioning one out of all the trays that were there. And so I think that's the message of hope. So, also a couple things, I'm supposed to tell you something personal so we relate this morning, right? I'm supposed to tell you something personal. I usually don't do that, but I will this morning. I put a photo on here. So this is a photo of a granary that's on the home place for myself, where I grew up. And the interesting thing about this is legislation that was passed in the U.S., it actually affected how I was raised a bit. So the Espionage Act of 1917 was put into effect. This is around World War I, okay? And then the Sedition Act was added in 1918. Anyone know what the Sedition Act was of 1918? Okay, what it said was, you can't have more than 5, in our case, we were all German heritage, in our case, you can't have more than 5 Germans gathered in one place speaking German. And so the local church had to close where I grew up because they couldn't meet. And they met in my grandfather's granary. And so church services were held in this granary during World War I, that era, because of the suspicion and the hatred for the German culture. And so consequently, it's an interesting thing. So for my dad, it was very important all of us kids spoke only English. Because I grew up in a house that my mother spoke fluent Dutch, German, and English, and my dad spoke fluent German and English. English was not their preferred language, but they spoke it. And it was very important that us kids could only speak English. And that was the influence, because you have to have church in a granary if you speak German. And so that was just a little bit of background. But Sedition Act got repealed. I think it was in place about 3 years. And so a lot of changes occurring during World War I. But I couldn't take that building down. Most of the buildings we've taken down on the old homestead place, but couldn't take that one down because it still has some meaning, right? Right. Okay, so now you know something about me. Way more than you need to. Okay, so we're going to do something here next. We're going to take a look at kind of the state of the Northern Plains. And we're going to walk through this in just 5 slides with 5 decades. And then we'll go into a little bit more in terms of a cropping system and gardening and cropping system with looking at the biological end, okay? But to set the stage of why we look at what we look at, I need some help on the first slide from all the old people, okay? Now I know there's really no old people in here, but some of you can maybe pretend to be old, okay? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with the 80s. Anyone remember the 80s? Okay, high interest rates. Okay, first time my wife Kathy and I looked at a house to buy in the 80s. I think it was 14 or 16% interest, 17%. We couldn't afford it. We said, that's really nice, but I can't afford it. And so it was the 80s, and it was the old, this is the Northern Plains now. This is our world. You might find part of your world in here. We had the first computers come into our offices. It was on a trial basis, 1983. Gave me a computer, and they said, well, we don't know if anything's going to come of this. There's no programs or anything for it. There's nothing work-wise on it, but you could use it for correspondence and, typing up a letter and that kind of thing is kind of how it started for us. HEL and wetland inventories plus CRP. So December 23rd, 1985, anyone remember the Food Security Act in this nation? Big, big, big legislation. We had no idea of the impact, but that was the bill that created CRP and HEL, the wetland legislation for us in the flyway in the Prairie Pothole region of this country. That was an impact, huge, huge impact. So I was looking at season-long grazing was dominant at that time in our world. Cattle were put on early, taken off late. Never moved out of that pasture. Okay, that's what we did. And we had full tillage. Everything was full tillage. But we were starting to look at what was called the Concord system. And that was sweeps on a large toolbar frame, and it was used for direct seeding. People liked it because it was big, it was wide. You could cover some serious acres. And so in our neck of the world, there were no cover crops. My thought on cover crops in the 1980s, they're okay for you, but I don't want anything to do with them. They take my water, they take my nutrient, they cost money. That's another operation. Why would I screw around with that? And that was kind of my thought, the initial thought. I had to get my head wrapped around plant physiology and start to understand that they're a carbon inlet. Didn't realize that in the 80s. I worked on the Missouri River bottom, primarily flood irrigation. So I did a lot of flood irrigation, land leveling, tailwater recovery, all these good terms, okay? Our dominant crop was spring wheat. We were breaking native rangeland like it was going out of style. Couldn't break enough native rangeland, right? It's where the carbon is. Big store of carbon. Man, you broke out native rangeland, you had crop production. It was the best on your farm, okay? We really didn't know anything about carbon, and I gave this a rating. Erosion control was poor, and I'm being kind. For us, erosion control was poor, okay? And conservation tillage was the term that was used. So if you had an event, conservation tillage, I always hated that term. Never liked that term because it was always way more about tillage than it was about conservation. It was really just tillage, right? Conservation was just thrown in there for a feel-good. And so that was us in the 80s. Okay, so everybody kind of remembers them, right? Ronald Reagan was president. Okay, this is back in the day. Well, then we went to the 90s. SCS became NRCS. They broadened their responsibilities significantly in terms of Farm Bill, okay? The first presidential email went out. I think it was Bill Clinton. I don't want to know who he emailed, and I don't know what he sent. And I don't need to know. I don't need to know. There's some things you just don't ask. But that was the first presidential email, was in 94. Start of no-till systems with diversity was in 93, okay? We had one of our local district supervisors, Gabe Brown, started a no-till system about in 93, 94. So we were working on what I still referred to as the Vogley farm at that time, because that was the farm I was used to working on, and one of Bill and Jean Vogley's daughters married one of the Brown boys, and I said to Bill, which one? He said, Gabe, and I said, well, I don't know any of them, but I know there's a bunch of them, and eventually away it went, okay? But it started out, for me, it started out as the Vogley farm and transitioned to the Brown farm. Tillage was still our dominant system. I stopped building structures on cropland sometime the end of the 90s. I decided to quit building structures, engineering structures, waterways, diversions, terraces, because I saw them as not addressing the problem. They were only addressing the symptom. And I decided to talk to, we had an NRCS statewide meeting in Jamestown, North Dakota, And I contacted him ahead of time, said I'd like some time on your agenda, and I'd like to talk about something we're calling soil health and those type of things. And the reply that came back to me was, we will give you 5 minutes before lunch if the real work is taken care of. Okay, I said, I'll take the 5 minutes, okay? And so 5 minutes before lunch, they looked at me and said, go ahead. And so I took the microphone and I made my announcement. I said, I'm not going to build structures anymore. I'm going to work on infiltration, and I'm going to work on cover crops, and I'm going to work on all these aspects that we feel is going to make a big difference. And it was kind of interesting because nobody asked a question, nobody said anything derogatory, nobody said anything. And that noon, you know, it's just 12 o'clock, that noon I had lunch alone. And I never looked back, because you knew it was right? It's not in the words of Jerry Hatfield, Jill, who's always told me, it's not rocket science. He said it's actually much more complicated and connected than rocket science, but it's something we can do. And I think we know how to do this. We know how to do this. We just have to put ourselves in a position to do it. And that can mean various things. That can mean politically, that can mean socially, that can mean financially. It can mean a number of things, but we know what needs to be done, and we know how to do it. But we have to want to do it and then put ourselves in the position to do it. So I think that's what we're really looking at. Okay? So that was in the 90s. So in the 90s, we had some single species cover crops, and again, that would have been Gay Brown. Started with some single and then some double, and the 90s started that way. Then when we got into the 2000s, we moved into the cover crop combinations. And so 2006, to be exact, was the first time we used cover crop combinations. And we had a big drought in 2006. And I thought, what a waste. What a wasted year. Because of the drought, we're not going to learn anything. And so we had all these species planted as monocultures, and then we had all of them planted in combinations. 2, then 3, then 4, then we put 5, then we put 6, and then 7. And then the most interesting thing was, during the drought, and it was a severe drought in 2006 for us, and what happened then was the multi-species, the highest diversity yielded the most. The monocultures didn't make it. Well, for us, that was like, what's going on? So then we took a backhoe, and we backhoed across all of them. So we could stand in each one of them and look at the profile and the root mass. And to this day, I remember in the 7-way, you know, the root mass was all the way down to the bottom, and it was in the center, and it was in the top, and it was all connected, and it was just a mass of roots. And I thought, how fascinating. Whereas in the monocultures, not like that. So you had that situation. So that was 2006. And we're starting no-till systems pretty strongly then. They came up out of Pure, South Dakota. And so Dwayne Beck, a lot of you know him at Pure, South Dakota. He was a big influence, and it moved from South Dakota into North Dakota. And we started much stronger. I think, like I mentioned, Gabe's started probably in 93, 94, be real close. By 2000, we had a lot of them on the ground, and we were pretty strongly into it at that time. So we're gonna, as I recall in the 2000s, was probably our golden, 2000 to 2010 was probably our golden period, because we still had pretty good diversity. Wheat was still just barely number 1, and corn and beans were behind it, but we had them all. We had them all. And then we had a pretty good amount of canola, pretty good amount of sunflower and flax. We had diversity, and we had covers. And we had a wheat window to put the cover on, right? An early wheat harvest, so we had a wheat window. We had a flax window, we had a canola window, we had some windows. And that was probably our peak, truthfully, in terms of diversity and erosion control. It was probably our peak. But then as we went further into this, we got into the 2010s, beans started coming on much stronger, wheat started dropping down, and then we started to run into a scenario where we ran out of our fall windows for cover crops. All these things started to come in. You can, as farmers, you can see this happening, right? You can see this happening. And then we started getting more erosion issues, okay? And as we went along, then beans eventually became the #1 crop and got really dominant, okay, real dominant. Corn kind of behind that, wheat kind of trailing in there somewheres, and everything else less. Well, then the interesting thing was, and yesterday I showed this chart where as you lower diversity, usually tillage increases. And in our world, especially vertical tillage. And so it's a high rate of speed. It has quite an impact on soil structure on the surface. And so when we got into that, all of a sudden people that had been in no-till systems were having all this erosion. And you know, it was a lack of cover. And it's, none of these plants are evil, but if you keep playing that card too frequently, it's what you would run into. Okay, so we're just gonna transition into the 2000s. First, polyculture covers, infiltration versus building structures. So now I'm working on infiltration. I'm not building structures anymore. I even told my employer, I'm not gonna build these anymore. It was futile. And we needed to work on the problem. The problem, okay. And now we had cover crops becoming the bridge between our grazing and our cropping. So the cover crops were a great bridge. Spring wheat was still our dominant. Minokan Farm started in 2009. YouTube came in 2005. So YouTube changed how we learn, right? I really think it did. I mean, it had a huge impact on everybody in this room, probably. It was the golden era of no-till diversity for us. This was our golden era. We were clicking. We had grazing systems with high recovery time, 40+ paddocks. We had a lot of recovery time. If you get over 90%, if you can get over 95% recovery time mathematically, you're gonna have some things happen in a grazing system. That's when it would happen, okay? And so we had breaking native rangeland still going on. Never slowed it, never slowed. And we had Red Trail ethanol start in 2007, and we started to understand that we needed carbon to build aggregates. So we're starting to put some pieces together. Erosion control was good, not excellent, but it was good. We started using soil health as a term in the lower right corner. We had George W. was in office, okay? And so he didn't send the first email, that was Bill Clinton, but you know, away we went. So then we went to the 10s. Soybean acres were rivaling spring wheat. They were just about neck and neck. We started using cover crops for planting green for beans to keep the fields from blowing away. So you get a green cover on it, usually in this case, a cereal rye. I'm not much of a monoculture cover crop guy, but in this environment, that's the one that would work. And the beans had no objection to it. It's a starter kit. Soybeans are a good starter kit for planting green, and they worked out well. We also did canola. Canola works out well for planting green also. And we started looking at direct marketing and stacking enterprises. People doing those kind of operations that I never envisioned. We had grazing systems with infinite recovery time. So single wire electric, sometimes you're just walking 5 or 10 steps daily, and we had really high recovery times in the high 90 percentiles. Breaking native grasslands, still happening in our environment, still happening. Wind erosion on no-till systems now, okay, because of the influx of low carbon crops. And we started to understand the 4 parts of carbon, okay, something we started to piece together. Because if you take a corn plant, 1/3 of the carbon's in the grain. Well, we're an extraction business in agriculture that's usually going to get tires, right? It's going to have tires under it, it's going to leave. So that part of the carbon's going to leave. 1/3 of the carbon's in the above ground mass. biomass. If we leave that lay on the soil surface, you're going to get some of that. A lot of it will oxidize to the surface, but you'll get some of that. Third of the carbon's in the root mass. You'll get a little higher amount of that because it's already in the soil. Fair amount of that will go for CO2 to the atmosphere, but you'll get more of that. And then the bigger portion, this fourth portion, if you will, that's the third and the third and the third of the plant. But then it gave exudates, the carbon sugars, into the soil the first 4 to 8 weeks. That's a huge item, direct feed to the biology, direct feed. And so we started to understand this a little bit more, okay? And then we started looking at regeneration, all kinds of terms over the years, but regeneration, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, okay? They were our presidents during that period. And then we got into the 20s. Our governor said we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. That's ambitious. That's not far off, right? How are we going to do that in North Dakota? Because we're very carbon orientated because of the Bakken oil field and because of the coal. You know, we got a 700-year supply of coal in North Dakota, and that's 2% of our reserves. Can you phantom that? 2% of our coal reserves gives us a 700-year supply. That's a lot of coal. So, and also that's where the critical minerals are now. And so we've done recent studies on that. So the coal coming out of North Dakota, the lignite coal in the future is going to have extraction of the critical minerals. That's going to be a game changer for us. The value of the coal will probably become secondary to the mineral. We'll see. Red Trail Energy injects first in the nation. We're injecting CO2. I'm not here to say it's right or wrong. I'm just telling you what's happening. Okay. So we're injecting CO2 because we have primacy. So North Dakota is the only state in the U.S. that has primacy. And primacy means you can go ahead and you have authority from EPA granted ahead of time to do a Class 6 injection well into a below ground formation. So we have the geology for this and we have primacy. We got primacy in 2018. Most of us in North Dakota, when we got primacy, we looked at each other and said, not sure what that is. But we found out. Okay? Primacy means you can go ahead and do this. Okay? So we did. Soybean became our dominant crop. Our salinity is out of control. So we were underwater geologically. Salinity, huge issue when you have bare soils. Huge issue. And it's not a pretty item and it's difficult to do, but you can change that. It takes a green plant, but you can change it. Gardening becomes just crazy interest in high tunnels and gardening. And so I started moving into it more myself in terms of monitoring soils in the garden, plant compatibility, all these things that make up the gardening world. Food security and nutrient density, they're two huge items. Guess what? Native breaking is still going on. So in our county, Burleigh County, there's 200,000 acres of native grasslands left. We have 58,000 under easement, perpetual easement, grassland easement. I think it's through U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I think when we're done, we'll maybe keep 60,000 acres. That's probably the most diverse ecosystem in the world, but we're going to watch it leave. U.S. Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, you're aware of those things. Future of carbon, every major company wants to be green. There's going to be a huge amount of money trading hands in this whole thing. The IRA Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, all these different aspects, there's a huge amount of money going to trade hands. I said to Kathy the other day, I said, when this is all done, and when the dust settles on all of this, if I still can't drive from Bismarck to Fargo during the daylight, so I usually only drive that during night because I don't like looking at the landscape. If I can't drive it during the daylight, then it was a colossal waste. We have to change the landscape. We have to have a greener landscape. We have to have plant diversity. We need animals on the landscape. All these things. It's not just idle old man talk. Because if we're seriously going to do what this is about, that's what that means. Unless we're not serious about it, then the money will just trade hands and nothing will change. That's the other side of the coin, right? That's what we have to decide. Erosion control now went fair to poor, so our erosion control is dropping. Regeneration is the term. So you look at all this, we kind of started out poor in the 80s, went to fair in the 90s, good in the 2000s, and we started coming down, 2010s fair to good, 2020s now we're fair to poor. Okay, so we did this in our environment. So let's go on and see what we're looking at. I want to talk a little bit about taking something like a vermicompost liquid extract, a little bit about the biological end of a nutrient system, because we know a fair bit about the chemical end and the physical end, but we don't know as much about the biological end, which is kind of interesting because the biological end runs everything. I mean, it's really the heartbeat of it all. So I started with making compost, and the key to this is you want local products. I don't want anything brought in from some other place. I want it all local. I want materials from my neck of the woods. I want things that evolved right there geologically. Those are things that fit. I know this, right? I don't want to buy it in a container. I want to have it all local. So I start with all local products, right? And then I started small scale, and I started extracting the leachate. In USDA, I had to call it vermicompost leachate. I couldn't call it worm juice because they said that doesn't sound professional. And I said, okay, I'll call it whatever you like, but vermicompost leachate is fine. And so call it what you like, but I'm extracting the liquid that comes through that ecosystem in terms of a completed compost with worms, okay? So you're looking at a much more concentrated scenario. So I started out pretty simple. I had infiltration in the tub. I used rainwater. I used gravity. And I started running the high tunnel with it, okay? And so I would inoculate the seeds or the transplants at the time of planting. That's the most important part. Needs to be on there at birth, okay? The birth of a plant needs to be born, germinated, in the high microbial environment, okay? And so then I would also put on 1 or 2 applications during the summer, okay? And so I also started moving into diversity of plants, all right, and started to understand that we need to be looking in terms of plant compatibility. The gardening world is much more complex because there are so unbelievably many plants. And then if you bring in the herbs, it just gets, there's a lot. And that makes it even more fascinating. If you're an old man with no life, you like this. So then I started looking at the mulches, and I started out initially with some of the tree weed fabric, if you're familiar with that. They call it bio, that it will decompose, but not in your lifetime, And so I didn't like that and moved into paper, and I moved into alfalfa. I liked those. This past year we did the alfalfa, and I also did the paper mulch. And so the paper mulch remember the old Kung Fu movie when he's walking on the rice paper trying not to break the rice? Okay, maybe that was too much for some of you, but okay, if you remember that, when you walk on this, when we put it on, we took our shoes off because that way it didn't break, okay? And once you have it down and you have some water on it, and wherever there's a seam, I seamed it with compost. And away we went, rolled it in between the corn rows, never had to do any weeding or anything. And so if there was a small weed, we just rolled right over it. And we started getting more diversity and started looking at all of these concepts, both indoors and outdoors, but I used the bioinoculant, and I would put on a foliar twice a year with the leachate. And then if I had aphids, I would add a molasses to it. And if I add the molasses to it and put it on, it would suppress the aphids. They lost their interest then because they couldn't digest it, okay? So you look at that whole thing and you look at people like, if you listen to Tom Dykstra or some of the entomologists, and they'll talk about the Brix levels. When they get to a certain point, 12 or whatever the magical number is, there's a lot of truth to that, okay? So indoors, outdoors, flowers also, I had to understand the flowers. Flowers are a huge item in gardening, and the insect world, because the colors. So you're interested in certain colors. I like all the colors, but the reds and the pinks and the yellows are really big in the insect world because they attract, okay? And so you start looking at them. So I started using them as movement. And then I brought in the cover crops. So I like a robust cover crop. That was kind of a little humor, but maybe it went by you. So see how my cover crop in the garden. Anyway, this is in my high tunnel. This is my cover crop. Do you think I'm building aggregates in that bed? Oh yeah, absolutely. The first 4 to 8 weeks, it pumped a lot of carbon in. After that, it started reversing and putting more carbon into the plant to make seed production, but it's all there, right? And I'll decompose that cover crop right onto the bed, okay? And then the Brix. So I can get a pretty high Brix level in the cover crop combinations, but I need a combination, right? So I had a 14, I think, that day. That was not that long ago, because in the high tunnel, you know, you can keep it green quite a while, and it'll eventually freeze down. And then I'll send in my leachate to the Molecular Research DNA Lab in Shallow-Water, Texas, and you get to understand the number of phylums and the number of species. And so typically it'll have about 370. The interesting thing, that'll vary each year, but the interesting thing about it, it'll always be roughly half bacteria, half fungi. Kind of spookily close, you know, which surprised me. Well, then we said, okay, that's fine, let's step into cropland. Okay, so then we needed a larger scale, so we built a concrete sloped pad, 2% slope from one end to the other. I'll put my flood irrigation background to work. So I designed a 2% slope on it, 2% grade to the center, and a 2% grade from one end to the other. And then it goes into a drain and into an insulated livestock tank. You can't let it go anaerobic, so you got to have some air movement through it. So you see some tile drain lines in there for air. And then I covered it with alfalfa. And then we have ourselves a pretty good situation because the worms are underneath the alfalfa. Okay, so I added the worms last. This is completed compost. So the worms can eat that. Okay, they have no teeth. So they need something kind of decomposed, right? Okay, so for whatever reason, that slide decided not to fully populate, but what it shows is I had watermelon. When I go to extract this just a few weeks ago, I put watermelon on the surface, okay, cut them in half, and they're hopeless addicts. I mean, the worms they're just hopeless addicts. So for the watermelon, I don't know what they wouldn't do for a watermelon. And so they'll congregate under the watermelon because they can send a signal out, right? They can talk, and they send a signal out. Everybody gets up underneath the melon, right? Let's see if I have that. It was kind of a cold day. And you can see it snowed there, and that was a few weeks ago. We lost that snow, but you can see how they congregated underneath, okay? So they're under the melons, then I take my spade, 5-gallon pails, put some in there, then I take them inside, put them in a Johnson Sioux composter inside over the winter. The rest stay out there. You know, a lot of the adults will probably just freeze and die, but, you know, the eggs might take off again in the spring, but I like to have some inside because I don't want to buy them. And just buy them one time, right? And then we can go ahead and use this in our cropping system. And we'll put it on in the planter, in the liquid tanks in the planter, directly into the seed, with the seed, all at the same time. So I usually do about 4 gallons to the acre. And somebody asked one time what book I got that out of, and I said, well, I had enough for 4 gallons to the acre. And that's why I used 4 gallons to the acre. And so farm boy background here. So we used to have this, not as much now, but you know, we still grow wheat, and we still need wheat, okay? We usually windrow ours. I try to use a minimal amount of herbicide, And so we'll go ahead and windrow it. That's fine. And if I take a look at some of the plant sap analysis, keep in mind now these fields since 2009 have had no commercial fertilizer. So that doesn't mean you can't build fertile soils, okay? But it's looking at different things. We used to look at N, P, and K, right? And so you can see what these started with. They started out with 18 parts per million nitrogen. And you want to convert that to pounds per acre, you take it times 2, because when I did the soils, I used 0 to 6. And if you're using 0 to 6, you can take 2 times your parts per million, and that'll directly convert you to pounds. So you know how many pounds of nitrogen we started out with. You can also look at malic. In this case, I have a malic phosphorus. I use all labs, I use all data. I just try to have a lot of it, because it's kind of like you going to the doctor. The more I know about the soil, the easier it is to diagnose things. Okay, so we've never added phosphorus ever, and it's been there since 2009. That's a pretty high malic. Okay, phosphorus is good. The interesting thing about phosphorus, you need biology to release it. The biology doesn't create phosphorus, but most of the phosphorus we've applied in the last 75 years is still in the soil. Then we looked at potassium. Well, we're naturally high in potassium, usually not a big issue for us because we're inherently high in it. But those are things we usually look at, right? So I do plant sap analysis, and I'll do it maybe every 2 weeks. And 80 grams of leaves, oldest functioning leaf, youngest functioning leaf, 80 grams of each. I send it in on a Monday. I take it on a Monday morning. By noon, I'm standing at FedEx or UPS or one of those places, and I'm shipping it. On Thursday, I'm reading the email as to what it is. And then it's early enough where you can make adjustments, okay, if you choose to. But it tells you a story. I like looking at a soil better, but the plant sap analysis is okay, right? It's secondary to the soil. That's just an internal thing. So what we really probably need to be looking at is things like this. Water-stable aggregates. I can sieve them myself, and I do sieve them myself, put them in a container with water and observe them. But the lab will do them as well. And so here I had a control area. So the 8C is the control area, and the 8 is the main field. And then the one on the right was respiration. Well, where I applied the bioinoculant, the respiration went up. Why? There's more biology there. Okay, so you're going to get a little bump on respiration. And then the microbial active carbon. Saw some pretty high ones yesterday, and I think it was on Russell's talk. Here I'm not that high on it, but it definitely impacted it, so it brought it up. And then in the far right, just looking at biology, I didn't have that much of a difference in biology at the end of May. They were fairly close. So these are indicators. And then I thought, well, let's look at corn as well. So that gave me a look at wheat. Let's look at corn as well. And so I had 60-inch corn with no covers and 60-inch corn with covers, okay? And so it was a little difference. If you look at the total biomass, I had double the biomass where I had the covers. Well, I also had more liquid carbon exudates coming into the soil. I had more food, okay? So I had a solid mass in field 7, and it really showed in terms of where I had 60-inch corn with no covers growing in between. On the 60-inch corn with no covers, we added those with a drone in August, okay? The one with the covers, we planted that, I think it was just shortly after the corn was planted. And then you look at the fungal component, quite a difference on the fungal. Protozoa, I'll find a lot of PLFAs with no protozoa. That's one of your big mineralizers. But the environment with the covers fostered protozoa as well. So you start looking at these aspects, and it's probably the soil respiration, the organic carbon, microbial active carbon. These are all things that tell us information that I didn't used to look at, right? But if we're going to be serious about putting the biological leg on, we need to look at these items. So also the nitrogen, comparison on the two fields. You can tell what we started with. Thank you. And you can give you a pretty good idea. I got the starting point, how much nitrogen was in the soil. Keep in mind, we haven't added commercial fertility in all the years we've been there since 2009. So pretty good start for us in our environment. Okay. The blue and the orange shows what the lab says is high. The blue would be a higher range, and the kind of brownish orangish color alongside the blue line would tell you the low range. So it kind of tells you where you're at. Okay. And likewise, again with phosphorus, so we got some fair malic amounts on there that would indicate that there's pretty good phosphorus in there. I didn't see any phosphorus deficiency. We haven't added phosphorus ever. And then the potassium, again, we're inherently kind of high in potassium. So then those are the things we would normally look at with plant sap analysis or any other analysis. And then you go look at the things that maybe we need to be paying more attention to if we're going to add this biological leg and if we're serious about adding it to the chemical and the physical components of it and finding our way down this road. We've talked this for a while, but talking it's one thing, finding a system to apply it in is different. So you can see what's been happening in the corn. So if you take a look at anytime you see a C behind the number, that was the control area with no application of leachate, okay? And so you can see 6C and 6 on the first one on the upper left for water stable aggregates. There's a nice upward progression, so it appears like it probably had some impact. 7 as well, not as much, but still had a little upward movement in terms of water stable aggregates. To me, that's a big indicator. The microbial active carbon, we had a little bit of that upward progression as well where the leachate was added. And then in the bottom, the soil respiration was a little more sporadic in one field, but showed itself in the second one. And then the biology in the lower right-hand corner, where we added the leachate and the food, a little bit of an upward progression as well. And we finished that with the mycorrhizal fungi, because the mycorrhizal many times is kind of like the holy grail, if you will. And so if we have the fungal component improving, pretty strong indication you might be on a good road. So we flew in the covers August 10th with the drone. Nice way to do that. Put in about 3-4 species. This year we had some water. When we have some water, we look so brilliant. When we don't have water, we don't look so brilliant. But you can do some things then in that particular environment, so that was a nice way to do that. So I'm just going to recap this biological carbon and capture. You need to describe your soil health principles. If you're going to use them, describe them for your area, your neck of the woods. I described them for USDA in North Dakota. So USDA posted them on their website for planners like me to use and for clients to use. All I did was write a description of each one for our neck of the woods, okay? Because it's different for everybody, different for every farm. Every farm's so unique. And so I'm gonna go through this quickly. The other day, I was working with the Grazing Coalition. They called me one morning. Some of you know Jerry Doan. He was with North Dakota Grazing Coalition. He's kind of a partner in crime of mine. And he calls me, he says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm shaving and drinking coffee and talking to you on speakerphone." And he said, "What do you got going today?" I said, "Whatever you tell me that I know this guy." I said, "Whatever you tell me that I have going." Well, he said, "We're going to meet at the Capitol." And he said, we're going to get an audience with the senator and a representative. We're going to make those arrangements today. So then he says to me, "So what are you doing today?" I said, "I'm meeting you at the Capitol to make arrangements with a senator and a representative." And he said, "Also write a description of the soil health principles in abbreviated format that could be put into a farm bill someday." Oh, sure. Sure, I'll have that for you shortly, no problem. So I wrote one, and my goal was 2 pages. And it had to be, if you look at the objectives here, Provide farms a financial tier participation approach by installing one or more of the principles. And anybody who wants this, I will send it to them. Or if your coalition, Minnesota Soil Health Coalition, wants this, I'll send it to you. Financially reward farms which have already installed and maintained them, because USDA has a long history of not doing that. I know. And then financial reward farms which are willing to install and maintain principles. Because when you install, you can improve your carbon, but you have to maintain if you're going to hang on to that carbon and eventually get it into humus. Curb the conversion of grasslands. So I'm an optimist. I want to curb these grasslands that you saw the last 5 decades. We just lost them every decade, right? I'd like to curb that. And then annual certification and easily verifiable. Some group has to do this, right? Some group, some entity has to do this. So it has to be easily verifiable. I think you should be able to certify, and it has to be easily verifiable. So I wrote up one for cropland. I used the little dollar signs, like when you Google a restaurant, and it's got like 4 dollar signs behind it. Okay, that's not McDonald's, right? If it's got $1 sign behind it, that might be McDonald's, right? And so I just did a structure, and it's really straightforward, but I'll give you an example. If you look at number 4, continual live plant, no cover crop, no payment. That's simple, right? You decide you're not going to put a cover crop on that field. That's not a problem. I mean, it's no payment on that acreage, but that's not a problem. You decide to put a single species on there, that's a payment. You put a multiple species on there, that's a higher payment. You put a full season, because a lot of states in the US do this, you put a full season cover on there, that's a little larger payment. You manage graze, that full season cover, that's an even higher one. Yeah, it's a structured format. 1 page for cropland, 1 page for grassland. And so you start, and also what this document does is it recognizes that grasslands are at the apex of soil building. And we've never admitted this. USDA has never come out and said, we got to protect grasslands because it's the best soil building. No, we just continue to take them out. Okay? But this is what built our soils. Does it really make sense to try to sequester carbon and take out your highest carbon sequestering system simultaneously? Don't answer that. Don't answer that. I don't want to hear your answer. That's my frustration, right? We're taking it out on one hand, but this is what built it. And there's nothing better that's going to build it. Okay? And maintain it and move it into humus. All right? It's hard to replace the work of 100+ species per acre. It's hard to do that. Okay, so you got your reading assignment. When you have these all read, you email me, I'll send you another list. And I have had a number of people do that over the years. And so I'd be happy to do that. So Kathy and I appreciate coming to Minnesota and visiting with you and connecting with you. We're going to be here the rest of the day. Be happy to visit with any of you at any time. Most of you at any time, because the old concept, there's always one. Thank you.